Have you ever imagined losing everything and being left behind by the one you trusted the most? Imagine for a moment that your life is full of dreams, but also of an immense weight, the weight of abandonment. This is the story of a girl, an orphan who grew up in an orphanage, surrounded by people who passed by without really seeing her. She was just another child without a family, without roots, without a place in the world. But, contrary to what many might imagine, she did not give in to sadness. Her soul was full of hope, like a flame that, despite being alone, still managed to shine in the darkness. She dreamed of a better future, of a life outside the four walls of the orphanage. Who knows, one day, a family would choose her, give her what she wanted so much, a home, affection, a sincere hug. She knew the chances were slim, but hope never left her, until one day, something unexpected happened. A wealthy family entered the orphanage, and this family was looking for a special girl to adopt. And among all the other children, she was the chosen one. She couldn't believe it. The dream was coming true. A luxurious home, a new life full of possibilities. The girl, now with a new name and a new family, felt like she was in clouds, believing that she had finally found her place in the world. What's more, this family had a daughter who, for her, soon became like a sister. Together, they played, grew, and shared secrets. Everything seemed perfect. What could possibly go wrong? Their lives were about to be transformed, and no one could have predicted the upheaval that was about to happen. But life, as you know, has a peculiar way of surprising us. What seemed to be the solution to all problems turned into a real tragedy. Fate often teaches us the most painful way that things can change in the blink of an eye. When you least expect it, everything can fall apart, and what seemed eternal turns to dust. The orphan girl, who had finally found a family, a home, and a friend, would be left behind, without warning, without explanation. A friendship built with so much affection would now become a distant memory, buried in a past that no one wanted to relive anymore. Imagine the impact of that. Abandonment, the void. That girl, who was once loved, was now just a shadow in the life of the rich family, an uncomfortable memory. The adopted girl, who had previously been by her side, now had all the love and attention of her parents, while she, the orphan, was left in a dark corner, forgotten and rejected mercilessly. The weight of loneliness crushed her, but somehow she survived. She was forced to grow up, to learn to be strong, not to depend on anyone. But what no one could have predicted was that, despite all the adversity, this girl would one day turn things around. She would use the pain, suffering, and anger of being abandoned as fuel to transform her life. And later, she would become a powerful woman, able to look into the eyes of those who rejected her and make everyone see the value of her journey. Now, years later, the fate of the two friends would intersect in an unexpected and impactful way. But what no one could imagine is that this turnaround would not be just a coincidence. It would not be a simple reunion. It would be a real battle of principles, values, and choices. A battle that would make both face each other, and that would bring to light the secrets of the past, the lies, and, above all, the consequences of those who chose to follow a path and those who were left behind. This story, as you can see, is not just about betrayal, revenge, or reconciliation. It's about the power to get back up in the face of adversity. It's about the journey of transformation of a girl who was once forgotten, but who, with determination and strength, earned her place in the world, even if it meant having to face those who were once her family. But, after all, how does fate bring these people back into our lives in such unexpected ways? What happens when you find yourself face to face with those who have abandoned you, but now on opposite sides of life? Get ready, because what comes next is a story that will thrill, surprise, and without a doubt, make you reflect on what is really important in life. And for those of you who are following this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any detail of this story that is just beginning. Everything seemed to have changed for the better, like a fairy tale coming true before her eyes. The rich family's home was everything she had ever imagined, with its large columns, immense gardens, and a staircase that looked like something out of a movie. She felt that she had finally found her place in the world. Her adoptive parents, smiling and welcoming, seemed to genuinely care about her. I would never have to sleep in a cold orphanage bed again. He would never again see the distant gaze of someone who no longer wanted to know his story. The orphan girl, who until then had lived in the midst of loneliness, found herself surrounded by all the comfort and love she had always dreamed of. The adoptive mother hugged her as if she were her own daughter, and the father, with his generosity and good humor, made her feel important, special, as if she were being cared for by a real family. At first, she believed that her life would never be the same. She allowed herself to dream of a future full of happiness, away from everything that had hurt her. But what surprised her most was the friendship that blossomed between her and the family's daughter. The adopted girl, with her bright smile and charming personality, immediately took her in like a sister. Together, they spent hours playing in the mansion's vast gardens, laughing at the little antics that only children can come up with. They shared secrets, dreams, and promises of a life in which they would always be side by side, inseparable like a true family. It seemed that life could not be more perfect. That friendship between the two girls seemed to seal their fate. They would grow up together, take care of each other, and over the years become best friends, perhaps even their closest confidants. She felt that she had finally found her forever home. There was no longer any doubt that things would get better from then on. With each passing day, she felt more home, safer, happier. The ghosts of the past, the memories of a cold and hopeless orphanage, seemed to dissipate, as if they had never existed. But life, as we already know, has its peculiar way of turning dreams into nightmares. When things finally seem to settle down, when happiness seems to be something conquered, fate has a habit of revealing its most surprising cards. The girl, who had begun to believe that nothing could separate her from the family she now called her own, would soon discover that all was not what it seemed. As luxurious as a home was, as much as the clothes were beautiful and the food plentiful, something inside her began to change. She gradually realized that the family dynamic was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. The parents, although loving, had a busy life and were often more focused on their social and professional obligations than on what really mattered. The relationship with their daughters, and the girl, who once felt loved and part of that family, began to notice something peculiar about the way her adoptive parents treated her, especially compared to the girl they had adopted before her. Despite the solid and sincere friendship he shared with the adopted girl, a sense of distance began to form in the air. It was as if, despite everything, there was something between them that could not be said in words. The orphan girl began to realize that, as much as they were together, there was something in her friend's behavior that was beginning to change. That complicity that once seemed unbreakable began to be tested by small attitudes, by small gestures of rejection. The girl who had previously called her sister now seemed more distant, more concerned with her own image and her parents' acceptance. It was a subtle change, but enough to generate a restlessness in the orphan, who, with her sensitivity, began to realize that not everything was perfect as it seemed. She began to ask herself, is all this real? Do I really belong here, or am I just being tolerated for convenience? Doubts began to arise, but she tried to ignore them, wishing that her new life was really what she dreamed of. However, the small changes began to pile up, and she could no longer ignore them. Something was going on behind the closed doors of the mansion, something she still didn't fully understand. The relationship with her adoptive parents, once warm, began to cool, and the friendship with the daughter of the family, which seemed to be her greatest joy, was now marked by an eerie silence, by a gradual estrangement that she could not understand. As someone who had always wanted a family, she found herself alone again, as if life was playing with her, giving her what she wanted most, but at the same time, taking away what she needed most, a true, safe, and reliable place. And it was at that moment, when the orphan girl began to question everything she believed, that the real turnaround happened. Actions and attitudes that once seemed harmless became part of something much bigger, something she could not control, and that would soon transform her life irreversibly. Her life, which had shown signs of prosperity, now showed the first signs of something much darker, and she did not know how to protect herself. The story of the orphan girl was about to take an unexpected turn. But through it all, the biggest question that arose was, would she be able to understand the truth behind the changes that were happening around her? Would it be possible for her to find out what was going on before it was too late? What she didn't know yet was that the answers to these questions were much closer than she imagined, and that her transformation journey was just beginning. It was as if the ground had disappeared from under his feet. In an instant, everything she knew, everything she had believed to be real, disappeared. The orphan girl, who until then believed she had found the love and security of a permanent home, saw her life turn upside down, without warning. The house, which seemed to welcome all her hopes, now seemed like an empty labyrinth. The door that had previously opened for her, with affection and warmth, now closed unceremoniously. The feeling of abandonment was more bitter than any words could describe. That morning, everything happened too fast. It was a day like any other, but at that moment something inside him told him that things were not right. Maybe it was the distantaneous look of the adoptive mother, or the lack of warmth in the father's gestures, but she already sensed that something was about to change. She had grown accustomed to seeing the gentle and protective behavior of her adoptive parents, but this morning that affection seemed fake, like a mask that was beginning to fall. And then the revelation, the change, came in a cruel and ruthless way. The orphan girl was called to the living room, where her adoptive parents were. The daughter of the house, the girl with whom she had shared all her secrets, was by their side, but there was something different in this girl's eyes. Something she couldn't comprehend at the time, but which, in time, would become impossible to ignore. The one she considered her sister now looked at her with a blank expression, as if she was no longer important, as if she had never been a part of it all. "I need you to understand, dear." The adoptive mother's soft voice interrupted her, but what she was hearing didn't make sense. The words seemed distant, as if they were spoken by someone in another world. She felt a huge emptiness grow inside her as she listened to the explanation, which seemed more like an excuse. The rich family didn't want her anymore. He didn't need her anymore. The orphan girl was no longer part of that dream that she believed to be real. All that remained were broken promises and an uncertain future. What once seemed to be the promise of a full life was now crumbling before his eyes. What she felt at that moment was more than pain. It was an emptiness that cut like a sharp knife. The words of the parents, trying to justify their decision, sounded like distant music, without melody, without meaning. They were turning away from her, leaving her behind. And that wasn't a choice. It was abandonment disguised as compassion. But the worst of all was the look of her friend, of the girl she considered a sister, the one who had promised to be by her side forever, the one she believed would feel her pain. Now, she seemed indifferent, as if the orphan girl were just another disposable piece, unceremoniously forgotten. The pain in the orphan's chest turned into an overwhelming sensation, as if it was impossible to breathe. Every word from the adoptive mother was like a punch in the stomach. She tried to understand. She tried to fight the feelings that consumed her, but she couldn't. The tears, which had previously been tears of joy and gratitude, now fell uncontrollably. What was once a home became an emotional battleground. And at the center of it all was the orphan girl, alone and desolate, not knowing how to react to such deep pain. But the pain wasn't just about physical abandonment. It wasn't just about being left behind, about being thrown back into loneliness. It was a feeling of betrayal, as if everything she had believed was nothing more than a lie, as if, as much as she had given her best, as much as she had tried to fit into that new world, she was never enough. What hurt her more than anything else was realizing that the girl with whom she had shared so many moments was now on her way, along with her parents, leaving her behind. The friendship, what she believed to be a true sisterhood, had been shattered in the blink of an eye. It was impossible not to feel that everything she had experienced, everything she had believed, was now turning into a personal tragedy. The orphan girl, who had already suffered so much in her life, was now marked by this new pain. She felt as if her soul had been ripped from her body, leaving a deep black hole with no end. She wanted to understand what had happened. She wanted to find some explanation, but there was no satisfactory answer. All she knew was that it had been discarded, as if it were a used and now unused object. The rich family's decision was more than just physical abandonment. It was a change in dynamics, a change in relationships, and the orphan girl felt it in every pore of her body. It was no longer needed. She was no longer the girl who deserved to be loved. The loneliness she had felt before the orphanage now seemed to be the only constant companion in her life. The sadness was transformed into something darker, something deeper. The orphan girl began to question herself about the value of friendship, the value of promises, and, even more, the value of life itself. How could I trust anyone after that? This pain she felt was not something temporary. It wasn't something she could just overcome. The sense of betrayal took root in her, like a bitter seed, growing and taking over every thought, every decision she made. And it was this pain that led her down a different path, a path of revenge and reconstruction. The orphan girl, who once believed that everything could be solved with love and patience, was now about to discover that sometimes what life demands of you is a radical transformation. And this transformation would not be about healing, but about strength, about power. She was about to embark on a journey that would change everything. Time passed, and with it, the marks of pain were transformed into something new. The orphan girl, now a young woman, found herself in a world that seemed to try to crush her at every turn. The emotional scars she carried, invisible to the eyes of others, shaped her in a way that no one could comprehend. She learned to work hard, more than anyone else she knew. Every moment of pain, every lonely night, was converted into strength and determination. Her journey was not easy, but she was determined not to be a victim anymore. The world, which seemed to have rejected her mercilessly, could now not ignore her. She became someone respected, someone who conquered everything she had through the sweat of her brow. His career grew steadily, overcoming adversity that seemed insurmountable. But inside, something still consumed her, the lack of a true emotional bond, the lack of a family that had supported her. The construction of his identity was based on something deeper than simple professional success. It was about a personal rescue, a way to show the world and herself that she didn't need anyone's acceptance to be great. She knew that, deep down, her greatest enemy had always been abandonment, and the only way to free herself from that was to build a life that was completely her own, where others no longer had power over her destiny. On the other hand, the adopted girl, who had previously shared the same dreams and the same laughter, followed a path that seemed completely distant from the one her friend was now following. In her new life, surrounded by luxury and comfort, she seemed to have everything the world could offer. The best cars, the most beautiful houses, the trips to the most exotic places. But despite all these possessions, something was missing. The girl who had been taken in by the wealthy family now found herself trapped in a life that seemed empty. She had been shaped by the expectations of her new family, but she felt no true connection to anything around her. While the young orphan overcame obstacles, struggled every day to make a name for herself, the adopted girl, who lived at the height of privilege, did not seem to find purpose in what she possessed. There was a sense of disconnection, as if she were walking down a road that, though covered in gold, led her to an uncertain destination. She lived in a world where challenges were minimal, but questions about her true worth never left her mind. She wondered, am I more than the material possessions that surround me? Where is the real meaning in my life? But these questions were swallowed up by the routine of parties, appointments, and appearances that the life of wealth demanded. She could barely remember the time she shared secrets with her orphan friend. She could barely remember the promises made and the moments they had shared. Now, all she had was a life without great difficulties, without great challenges, but also without great emotional achievements. It was as if she were being carried by a river, unable to control the direction in which it was leading. Luxury did not fill the emptiness she felt in her soul. Meanwhile, the young orphan became a strong, focused woman with a growth mindset that guided her. She had learned not to depend on anyone to move forward, not to expect favors from fate. Her life was built on the foundations of overcoming, resilience, and, above all, the search for respect, something she had lost when she was abandoned by the rich family. For her, success wasn't about how much money she had, but about the truth of her journey, about the recognition of her effort. And although she knew the world was full of obstacles, she wasn't afraid to face them. The two women, now on completely different paths, went about their lives with intensity, but unaware that fate was about to intertwine them in a way that neither of them could have predicted. The contrast between them was evident, one seeking stability and respect, winning each victory with courage, and the other living in abundance, but in search of something deeper, something that money could not buy. What would be able to unify these two distant destinies? What could bring out the hidden truth that lurked in the shadows of both lives? The questions hung in the air as each of them continued to follow their journey, unaware that at some point in the future, their lives would intersect again in a way that would change everything. And so, the two women followed, not knowing what the future held for them, one in search of a deeper meaning, the other in a constant battle against the scars of the past. Time seemed to be in no hurry to reveal the next steps. The real transformation was yet to come, but the impact of these distant lives was about to intertwine, and what seemed distant, almost impossible, would begin to make sense in an unexpected way. Life has a curious way of putting us in each other's path, even when we think that fate has already traced our trajectory forever. Time, like a river, takes us in unexpected directions, and this is how, years later, fate prepares a reunion of the two women, now transformed by the experiences they lived. But what they don't know is that this reunion will not be casual. It will not be like those coincidences that life brings us to remember the past with affection. No, what was about to happen bore the mark of justice, and this story had something much bigger to reveal. The young orphan, who was once left behind, was now a strong woman, unbeatable in her career. She had become a judge, a respected authority, someone who had built her own identity without needing anyone's help. His name was synonymous with ethics, firmness, and, above all, justice. Her past, with all its wounds and scars, had not broken her. On the contrary, he had made her stronger, more ruthless. His journey, once one of personal overcoming, now turned into a mission to ensure that those who erred had the weight of their decisions, and those who sought justice could trust the system. She had a mindset focused on what was right, on what was just, and no one could divert her vision from a world that was still in need of transformation. But because life is unpredictable, what she didn't know was that, at that very moment, the woman who had once been her friend and confidant, the adopted daughter of the wealthy family, was about to come into her life again, and in a way she could never have imagined. It was a case like any other, a routine process that did not arouse more than a glance of attention among so many others. But when the name of one of those involved was presented in the courtroom, something stopped in time. She looked up the name, and a wave of familiarity hit her like a punch in the stomach. Her eyes narrowed and she paused. Something inside her broke at that moment. She knew exactly who that person was. It was she, her old friend, the girl who had been left behind, the girl with whom she had shared so many moments and dreams. But now, she stood before her, no longer as a friend, but as a criminal accused of a scandal that was shaking the structures of high society. It was a devastating scandal. The daughter of the rich family was involved in a crime that, if proven, could forever tarnish the name of those influential people, that elite that she had once, in childhood, dreamed of being part of. The accusation was serious, and the judge knew that as a professional. She could not let emotions influence her judgment. But what did she feel? What could she do in the face of that truth she now faced? A childhood friend, whom she considered almost a sister, was now in the dock, and the weight of that reality was something she never imagined she would have to carry. She watched the woman there, in front of her, with a pale face, her eyes full of regret, and she could see, behind the posture of someone who tried to maintain her dignity, the weight of a past that could not be erased. The young orphan who had become a judge wanted, with all her being, to understand what happened. How had that happened? How could your friend, with all she had, have been involved in something so dark? But what hurt most was the fact that, deep down, she knew that this was no ordinary reunion. It was no longer about shared laughter or promises made when they were still two children who did not know what the world had in store for them. Now, there was something much bigger at stake, and, in some ways, much more personal. The tension grew every day. The judge did not know if the weight of responsibility she felt on her shoulders was greater than the pain of being in front of that woman who, in some way, had left her behind. She couldn't allow the old friendship to interfere with her decisions, but the question was, how to maintain objectivity in the face of something so deep, so connected to a past that she had always tried to bury? Judgment was approaching, and the path to justice was becoming increasingly cloudy. Would it be possible to separate the pain of the past from the need to do what was right? What else could be done? The truth was before her, but was she ready to face it impartially? She looked at the accused again, now more closely, trying to perceive through that facade the woman she once knew. It was difficult. Everything was so complicated, so dense. Guilt and regret seemed to fill the room. But what she didn't know, what she still couldn't fully understand, is that this reunion wasn't a coincidence. Fate had taken care of setting them on the same path, and what was about to happen wasn't just about justice. It was about something much deeper, something that defied the very nature of redemption. As the evidence piled up and the case unfolded, an inevitable question hung in the air. Would the reunion of these two lives, so different, so marked by choices and mistakes, really be the moment of justice? Or was there something else at stake? The judge knew that the decision she would make would change everything. But could forgiveness somehow play a role in all this? Could justice be more than a simple sentence, more than a punishment? Or would it be the chance to rescue, to heal, to transform pain into something new? With the weight of responsibility growing, the judge found herself at a crossroads, and their journey, in one way or another, was about to take a turn, testing not only her ability to be impartial, but also what she truly believed to be the core of her mission, justice or forgiveness. The story that took shape in that court was much more than a legal process. It was a mirror of the past, a reopened scar, a confrontation between what was experienced and what remained. The judge, in front of everyone, kept her posture firm, her eyes serene, but inside a whirlwind was stirring. The memories crashed against his mind like waves on ancient rock. She remembered the smell of childhood, the light laughter that came from her friend, the moments when they looked at each other like soul sisters. But there now, in front of her, there was no longer that girl. There was a woman accused of a crime, and not just any crime. A crime that involved manipulation, greed, and, perhaps, the breaking of everything that once meant loyalty. The case was complex and came with layers of silence and power. The adopted daughter, who grew up surrounded by privileges and comforts that the judge never knew, had used her influence in a plot of financial corruption. Using the surname of the family that took her in, she was involved in a millionaire scheme of embezzlement of public funds. It was an operation that involved overpriced contracts, shell companies, and an intricate game of appearance that served to launder money and hide illegal movements. For years, the evidence was obscured by his ability to move between social and political spheres with charm and eloquence. She presented herself as a philanthropist, a supporter of social causes. But behind the facade of a respectable woman, there were decisions that directly hurt those who depended on the public system. The hidden truth now surfaced like a wound that suppurates. And every new document, every testimony that made it to the judge's desk, felt like a personal blow. She tried to stay neutral. But the past pulled her, dragged her into a narrative that she had not chosen to relive. After all, it was impossible to ignore. She was in front of the girl who had been chosen in her place, the one to whom her adoptive parents said yes, while she listened to the silence of rejection. Now that same girl, grown up and involved in a scandal of national impact, depended on the impartiality of those who were left behind. It was cruel. It was symbolic. It was as if the universe had saved this moment to test how far the integrity of a person who survived the pain and built everything with his own hands goes. The judge knew she couldn't allow resentment to make decisions for her. His role was to enforce the law. But emotions knocked on the door without asking permission. She looked at the woman in the dock and saw two overlapping versions. The child who once shook her hand with promises of eternal friendship, and the adult who betrayed the most basic values of honesty. The dilemma was real. How to be fair to someone who symbolized so much unresolved things? How to be rational when the case itself forced her to die behind the scenes of her own story of abandonment? While the case records took shape, the pressure increased. The media began to cover the case voraciously. Sensationalist headlines tried to link the judge to the defendant in an emotional way, as if her impartiality was already corrupted only by the past. Public opinion was divided between those who demanded exemplary punishment and those who saw the story of the two as a modern soap opera about fate and choices. But what no one knew was the silent weight that the judge carried alone every night, when the courtroom emptied and the process remained open, not just on paper, but inside her. She couldn't sleep. He relived his childhood in fragments. She recalled the moment when her friend was chosen by the rich family, while she remained in the shelter, waiting for a return that never happened. She went over the face of the woman who was now before her, no longer with luxury clothes and photographic smiles, but with the tired eyes of someone who was finally unmasked. And there, between what was and what is, the judge was forced to face her own transformation. Everything she had built, her strength, her justice-focused mindset, her emotional independence, was now put to the test. There was something cruel about that coincidence. It was as if the universe was trying to balance an ancient scale, placing before the woman who once had everything she didn't have, but who now fell off a pedestal built on lies. The hardest thing, however, was to understand what he really felt. Anger came in waves, followed by a sadness she couldn't name. It wasn't just disappointment with the defendant. It was a mourning for something that never had a chance to flourish. A true friendship, perhaps, or even the simple right to grow up side by side with someone who shared their childhood. The complexity of that moment was far beyond what anyone in the courtroom could have imagined. It was about decisions, yes, but it was also about humanity, about the impact that the past has on the present, about the backstage of emotions that no one sees. Because even though she was a judge, even though she carried in her chest a mission of being the pillar of equity, she was human. And humans feel it. Humans have memories. Humans also bleed inside, even when they appear to be made of steel on the outside. Each day of the hearing was a new challenge. The judge listened to the lawyers, read the reports, asked questions precisely. But his gaze, that gaze that had previously been only technical, now carried a density that was difficult to hide. It was impossible not to notice that there was something else there, something unsaid, something that burned in silence. And the most intriguing thing was to realize how the defendant, the one who had once been her friend, also felt the weight of that reunion. In the eyes of the accused, there was more than fear of conviction. There was shame. There was an apology never uttered. There was a mute recognition that, even surrounded by privilege, it had failed. Not only with society, but with the one that had once been part of its history. The truth, now, was no longer just legal. It was emotional. And this truth presented the judge with a difficult choice. Judge with reason alone, or allow the heart to have a voice as well. Was it possible to completely separate justice from empathy? Or is it that, in some cases, true justice requires facing the pains of the past and finding a new meaning for them? That was the journey before her. A narrow path between duty and feeling. A territory where logic and emotion competed for space in each decision. The court followed, the testimonies continued, and the country watched. But inside that cold room, where people's fates are decided, there was something much bigger at stake. The reconstruction of a fragmented truth, where every piece of the past came back to say that nothing, absolutely nothing, is a coincidence. Everything has a purpose. And that reunion was not the end of anything. It was just the beginning of something much deeper, something that had yet to be revealed. In the courthouse, the weather was as thick as fog before the storm. Every glance cast at the woman sitting in the dock carried more than curiosity. There was trial, muffled murmurs, assumptions, and also an almost suffocating expectation that something far beyond the law would be decided there. The judge, with her impeccable toga and the posture of someone who has learned to harden her heart without losing her humanity, felt the eyes of the whole room weighing on her. But no look weighed more than that woman's. The woman he had once called friend, or maybe sister, even if she had never uttered that word out loud. It was her, the adopted daughter, the one that was chosen. The crime that now opened the wounds of the past seemed even more cruel, because it came precisely from those who received everything the judge dreamed of having. The accusation was clear: embezzlement of public funds, influence peddling, and use of false documents. But what was really shocking was the way everything was done. The defendant used the name of the adoptive family as a shield. She presented herself behind the scenes of social events as the daughter of the renowned couple, manipulating people, decisions, resources. He built an impeccable image on the outside, while on the inside, he created a dark web of hidden interests. She had learned from the best. It is true. She frequented the same circles of power that the judge never knew in her childhood. But he used this learning to corrupt to hide, to deceive. The judge knew that, sooner or later, that truth would come to light. But what she didn't expect was to be right there on the other side of the bench, to be responsible for drawing the line between justice and the past. Because even with all the codes and legal manuals on the table, nothing explained how to judge someone who was part of your absence, that she lived the life that perhaps she would have lived if she had been chosen. And there she was, standing in front of this woman who seemed more confident than regretful, as if, even sitting in the dock, she was still protected by her surname, by her money, by her connections. There was something almost cinematic about that scene, a twist that only real life would dare to put together. The courtroom was no longer just a stage of justice. It was now also a mirror of everything that the judge tried to bury, because behind the firm stance, the technical decisions, the impeccable ethics, there was a girl who asked herself every day, why not me? And to see the one who was chosen using what she received to harm others, to lie, to benefit herself, it was like tearing a scar that never really healed. The dilemma was brutal. The law told the way. The evidence was irrefutable. But his heart beat strongly, fed by decades of silences, absences, invisible comparisons. And even though she had never talked about it, it was the most personal judgment of her life, not only because she knew the defendant, but because, in a way, she was also being judged there. Its values, its strength, its transformation. There was a moment when his eyes crossed those of the accused. And in that brief instant, everything came back like a silent avalanche. The days in the shelter, the looks from the outside to the inside of the fence, the disguised joy when they knew there would be a visit, even if it wasn't for them. And the moment when she saw her friend being taken, chosen, loved, welcomed, while she stayed. Time passed, but that feeling of abandonment never completely went away. He was only hidden behind a toga, camouflaged between technical decisions and well-written sentences. In that room, the silence was broken only by the turned pages of the records. But the real noise happened inside. It was a noise of conflicting thoughts, of emotions trying not to run through their eyes. She couldn't afford to falter, but I couldn't pretend it didn't hurt either. The defendant, curiously, kept her chin up, as if she still believed that her personal history exempted her from responsibility, as if, deep down, he hoped for some clemency, one last chance to escape unscathed. After all, they were facing someone with common roots, and perhaps that was precisely what made it even more dangerous, because he used pain as a shield, history as a justification, and his name as armor. But the judge knew, being a victim of the past does not give us license to destroy the present of others. And that's when the real weight of the decision fell on her. It was not enough to apply the law. It was necessary to separate oneself from one's own history, as if to tear off a piece of the soul and leave it outside the court. But was it possible? Was there a way to completely separate reason from emotion when everything on trial represented, in some way, her own past? She knew what the law was asking for. He knew what the facts proved. But he also knew what his pain was screaming. The dilemma was deeper than many there imagined. It wasn't just a matter of right or wrong. It was a silent battle between the impartiality required by the function and the humanity that resisted being ignored, between the justice that the toga represented and the wound that childhood still left open. Everything in that room seemed motionless, as if time had stopped waiting for a verdict that exceeded the limits of the law, because it was not just a financial crime. It was about betrayal, about impact, about decisions that shaped destinies. The judge was not only deciding the future of the defendant, he was, in a way, rewriting his own history, giving a new meaning to abandonment, and also, perhaps, ending a cycle that never ended. But at that moment, in front of everyone, there was only one question that echoed without a clear answer. Could she be fair, or would you let the pain of the past speak louder? The tension was there, alive, pulsating, as if every person in that courtroom was also being challenged to look inward. And so, with her eyes fixed on the woman who was once her friend, the judge prepared herself for the moment when everything, absolutely everything, would be put to the test. And it is exactly at this point in the journey that things take an even more intense turn. The silence in the courtroom was dense, almost solid, as if every look, every contained breath, formed an invisible wall around the judge. She was there, sitting in her position of authority, but inwardly it was as if she were in free fall. The face of her friend, now a defendant, looked like a yellowed photograph of a time that never returned. The eyes of that woman, the same ones that had once cried together in nights of shared despair, were now fixed on her with a mixture of pleading and resignation, and it tore her inside. She knew that everyone there was waiting for a decision, and not just any decision. They were waiting for the truth with a capital T, which carried the weight of justice and the cut of impartiality. But there was something else at stake. There was the backstage of the story that no one there knew, the intertwined childhood, the secrets whispered in the dark, the promises that today seemed like cruel jokes. The judge knew that the truth was not just what the records showed. It was also what had never been written about, the silent pain, the sense of betrayal that corroded without leaving visible scars. And then came the moment, the instant all eyes turned to her. The words began to come out, and with each sentence, the tension increased like the rising sound of thunder before the storm. She spoke with the firmness of someone who knew there was no room for weakness there. He explained the seriousness of the case, the elements presented, the responsibility of his position. But even with a firm tone and precise rhetoric, there was something behind the voice, an almost imperceptible trace of bitterness. In mourning, her friend in front of her stood up. She was no longer the fragile girl she had welcomed, nor the confidant of other times. She was an accused woman, yes, but she was also someone who knew her deepest fears, her insecurities, her flaws. And that was a danger, because that woman there, even under trial, could still touch her in a way that no one else could. When she tried to explain herself, when her trembling voice tried to reconstruct the pieces of her version of the facts, the impact was immediate. It was not a technical defense. It was a human appeal. "I didn't mean any harm," he said, in a tone that the microphones didn't fully pick up, but that the judge heard as if it had been whispered directly in her ear. "You know me. You know I'm not like that." The judge swallowed. The room remained silent. She looked at that woman, and for a second, a single second, she wanted to be anywhere else. "I wanted to be just an ordinary citizen, free from the toga, from responsibility, from difficult choices." But it wasn't. And there, at that moment, she had to face the essence of her own transformation, that of someone who was forced to kill a part of herself to fulfill her duty. She took a deep breath. He felt the weight of his own past pressing on his shoulders, as if he himself demanded reparation. And then, with the coldness that only comes after a long internal battle, he said what needed to be said. That justice was not a choice, it was a path. And that she, as much as she still felt the wounds of betrayal, could not afford to give in to anger, because if he did, he wouldn't just be punishing a culprit. He would be betraying everything he had built up to that point. He would be erasing his own journey. It was not a tearful statement. It was a manifesto of conviction. She made it clear, with all her words, that forgiveness was not something that fit in that courtroom. The law was not about feelings. It was about responsibilities. And even with her heart in pieces, she knew that keeping the law was the only way to honor herself. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he knew that any decision outside of that would be an escape, a denial of one's own trajectory. The friend, upon hearing the sentence, did not cry, but his eyes lost the light they had. It was as if there at that moment they had both understood that something had died between them forever. There was no more room for reconciliation, nor for late justifications. The decision was made, and with it, a new void emerged. The judge didn't look back when she stood up, but inside her, something burned silently. It was the question that still echoed. Had she lost everything she once loved most? This restlessness has not gone away. He remained like a shadow stuck to his thoughts, an invisible mark that no toga could hide. After all, it was not just the outcome of a trial. It was the end of an era, of a relationship, of an illusion. And even with the certainty of having chosen justice, the feeling was that something essential had been broken forever. She left the room carrying not only the weight of decision, but the awareness that there are choices that transform us irreversibly. choices that do not allow return. And as the clatter of shoes echoed through the cold hallways, a new layer of silence settled in, now no longer in the courtroom, but within herself. And it was in this silence that a different kind of echo began to occupy the space that once belonged to fury, doubt, and fear. It was a dry sound of reality settling down. The trial was over. The verdicts had been pronounced. But what came next? Nobody really teaches that. No one prepares you for silent shards that come when the lights go out and each character goes back to being just ordinary people trying to figure out what's left of themselves. The judge returned to her office with measured steps, as if she had yet to convince her own body that she had done the right thing. Inside, away from the eyes that were waiting for her in the corridors, she allowed herself to close the door with more force than necessary. It was the most emotional gesture that was authorized that day. Then he sat down at the table, the cold wood against the palms, their hands crossed, as if they were still trying to hold some part of it all. And the silence, that same silence of the court, now stuck to her like a second skin. There was, indeed, a certain relief. But it was a dry, pragmatic, distant relief. The kind of relief that doesn't warm up, just confirms it. She knew she had done the right thing. Of that there was no doubt. But doing the right thing sometimes has a cost that justice does not calculate, the void that remains after the decision, that which does not fit in the processes, nor in the records, nor in the sentences. What really hurts is not the act, but what it leaves behind, a friend, a story, a part of herself that she had to abandon along the way. And this abandonment had a name, it had a face, it had a memory. At the other end of the city, the woman who was once a Sister Hart now found herself inside a completely different space. No toga, no judgments, no applause. Only walls, grids, and the cold realization that the choices we make, even those that we believe to be small or justifiable, carry consequences that do not respect our version of facts. She didn't cry. No more. I was past that stage. What came now was something else. It was the weight of understanding. The raw realization that, in trying to manipulate the threads of fate in her favor, she had become entangled in a web that dragged everyone around her. In the silence of the cell, the memory of their childhood together came in involuntary flashes. A rusty swing, the muffled laughter under the sheets, the secrets shared with the innocence of those who did not imagine what the future hid. It was strange to remember so clearly moments that seemed to belong to another life. And maybe it was really another life, because that version of her, the one who played, dreamed, and believed that affection could fix everything, no longer existed. What remained now was a marked woman, exposed, naked in the face of the consequences. And yet, even so, there was something almost sacred in the pain she felt, a pain of someone who finally understood the damage he caused. Outside, the world kept turning, as it always does. But for both of them, the weather had changed pace. The judge returned to the hearings, to the daily decisions, to the processes that arrived like endless waves. But inside her, something has shifted. The image of her imprisoned friend, so strong in her memory, began to visit her at the most unexpected moments. At breakfast, at the sound of a similar laugh, even in the mirror, when she looked into the eyes and saw a trace of that pain reflected there. She was still firm. It's true. The armor of impartiality remained standing, but there were cracks. Small, almost invisible, but real. With each difficult decision, the memory of the trial came back as a reminder that there is no justice without humanity, and that, sometimes, it is precisely this humanity that bleeds the most in the process. Meanwhile, her friend faced her new routine with a kind of brutal lucidity. There was no room for self-pity. She knew that her mistake was not only in the acts committed, but in the choice to remain silent when she could have trusted, of manipulating when he could have asked for help. And now, surrounded by royal walls, what hurt the most was the absence of who, for so long, had been her only real family. She missed the judge's gaze. But not from that look of now, impersonal, distant protocol. I missed the look I had before, which recognized her, which she understood even when she didn't understand herself. The two followed their separate journeys, but connected by something that no sentence could erase. The hidden truth behind everything was not in the records, nor in the final decision. It was in the irreversible impact they had on each other's lives. And that, no matter how much time tried to soften, would still be there, like a poorly closed scar. The judge learned to live with this mark, not as a burden, but as part of the transformation that his own story demanded. Her friend, on the other hand, within the limits imposed by the new reality, sought to understand who she could become now that everything that defined her had collapsed. They had made their choices, and now they needed to learn to live with them. But what really remained, after all, was a question that no sentence could answer precisely. What is worth more in the end, the justice or the bond that has shaped us from the beginning? Because between the right and the human, sometimes the abyss is greater than we imagine, and perhaps the true judgment, the one that lasts longer than any penalty, is the one we hold inside us every day while we try to understand that the price we paid was really what was necessary, or just the inevitable. And even if over time memories were away like forgotten photographs in a drawer, there are pains that do not lose color. They don't scream, they don't complain. They just remain, because they are made of what cannot be undone. They are the scars of what was once love, trust, partnership, and that now, even broken, still pulsates in some deep layer of memory. None of that had been in vain. No choice, no matter how harsh, had been random. It was all part of a larger journey, a journey that required impossible decisions, but which also revealed truths that, until then, were hidden. Behind the scenes of pain, in the details that no one sees, was the real transformation, the one that is not measured in time of sentence, but in the type of person that each one became later. And perhaps, precisely there, between the silence of the toga and the cold of the cell, the most difficult space of all was born, that of true reflection, the one that requires courage, humility, and a brutal honesty with itself. A space where masks fall, where pride is undone, and where, finally, we face what really matters, the value of friendship that was lost, the weight of justice that was imposed, and the awareness that, even separated, neither of them came out unscathed. Life went on, yes, but now with other tones, other contours. And even though each had taken opposite paths, both carried the same invisible heritage, the memory of what they were to each other, and the certainty that certain choices cannot be undone. Just understood. She took a long time to open the last letter. It had been there, on the table, for weeks. The worn envelope, folded at the ends, already seemed to carry the weight of time. It was the 19th, and she knew, even before tearing the seal, that it would be the last. Something in that trembling handwriting betrayed a tiredness that was not physical. It was a fatigue of those who finally understand that there is nothing more to be said, not even a request, nor justified. She took a deep breath before opening it. The courtroom was now empty. There were no longer flashes, no journalists, no hubbub in the corridors. It was just her, and that silence that always comes back when the pain begins to settle in another corner of the body. The reading was slow, spaced words, torn confessions, but without drama. The woman who was once his best friend now recognized, with all the letters, that she was wrong, who tried to manipulate, deceive, use affection as a shield. But he also recognized something that hurt more than any crime, that at some point he chose to lose himself. "I don't write to ask for forgiveness," said the final excerpt. "I write to let you know that, as much as justice has been done, I now understand what it cost you. It wasn't easy for me to be judged by you, but it must have been even harder for you to judge me. I thank you for having courage. Courage that I never had." The judge read and reread that paragraph, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to cry, not out of pity, nor out of regret, but for everything that was destroyed by silence, by omission, by the time when neither of them had the courage to face the truth while it could still be transformed. The following week, she decided to visit her, not as a judge, not as a wounded woman, but as someone who needed to see with his own eyes what was left of what, one day, was fraternal love. Prison wasn't welcoming. It never is. But there was a strange peace in that reunion. Neither of them tried to explain anything. There were no more questions, only presences. The old friend's face was marked, not only because of the wrinkles of time, but because of the weight of those who learned too late the difference between guilt and responsibility. The hug didn't come, but there was no rejection either. They looked at each other for long seconds, and in that look, there was something stronger than the past. There was acceptance. "I'm not the same anymore," the condemned woman said in a low voice. "And I know you're not either." The judge nodded. "Maybe we were never who we believed we were to each other," he replied. "But now, at least we know who we really are." The conversation lasted a few minutes. There wasn't much to say. And, curiously, it was precisely this silence that sealed the end of the story. A dignified, clean end, without revenge, without empty promises. Upon leaving prison, she walked slowly through the parking lot. The sun was beating down the asphalt, but inside her, the feeling was one of relief. Not that relief that comes when everything is resolved, but the one that arrives when you finally stop fighting against what you can't change. When you understand that not every bond needs to be redone, that some just need to be honored by memory and left in the right place, in the past. Months later, the former friend was transferred to a semi-open regime. I was working in the library of a women's unit, helping other inmates write letters, fill out appeals, discover their own voices. She seemed lighter, not free, because there was still a lot to repair, but, in a way, at peace with the reality I had chosen to build. For the first time in years, he seemed to finally know who he was, and the judge followed. He continued to judge cases, facing dilemmas, living with human stories that often resembled his own. But something about her had changed. She no longer looked at the defendants with the same technical coldness, nor with the gaze of someone who needs to protect himself so as not to get involved. She learned that empathy does not weaken justice. It strengthens it. A few years later, she was invited to lecture on ethics and judicial impartiality. He spoke about the case. No names, no details, but with the soul exposed. He explained what it means to judge someone who once shared the plate with you. He explained that there is no absolute neutrality when you are human, but there is integrity, and what integrity it is to do right even when right hurts. In the audience, a young student cried silently. At the end, he approached her and said, "I always thought that justice was synonymous with rigidity. Today I understood that justice is, above all, an act of courage. Thanks." The judge smiled, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something like peace, because in the end, the story wasn't about revenge, nor about crime. It was about truth, about the human capacity to fall and get up, to be disappointed and move on, to break ties and still maintain respect. And, above all, about the power that each one has to make choices and to answer for them with dignity. That was the story of the two. Two women who loved each other, betrayed each other, judged each other, and finally freed themselves, each in their own way. And even without reconciliation, they found what they were looking for most, the chance to move forward with a clear conscience. If this story hooked you from start to finish, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Here we go deep into the emotions, the difficult choices, and the truths that no one has the courage to tell. You don't want to miss out on what's next.